to August 5th, 2010. And we're in northern Chile. In northern Chile, there's a copper and gold mine that's called San Jose. 33 miners are working a half a mile underground when all of a sudden 700,000 tons of rock collapse on all the mine shafts. Those 33 miners were completely sealed off from the world above, and they're stuck a half a mile underground. Thankfully, they were able to get to an emergency shelter that was called the Refuge. This is a place, it's a living room size chamber that they had built down there so that people would have a place to kind of, if people had to stay a little extra or when they would have their breaks. And so they made it into this little area and air was pumped into that little area. But it was never designed to house and feed 33 people for weeks and weeks, maybe months on end. So the miners miraculously were able to get to that refuge. And there they did, what's the first thing they did? They did an assessment. All right, how much food do we have? Well, they took it all, they gathered everything they could from that refuge, that area, and to their surprise, there was only a total food to feed them all for 2 days. 2 days, buried under 700,000 tons of rock. They had no way to call to the surface. They were trapped down there alone. They knew enough to know that without food and the high likelihood of never being found, this might be it for them. This might be how the story ends for those 33 miners. Well, miraculously, 17 days into it, they're still alive, but barely. They stretched those 2 days of food as much as possible. Their buffet meals that they had every other day consisted of a little scoop of tuna and a little bit of milk. Their world had been reduced to a little bit of tuna, a little bit of milk, a small little space, darkness, and the thought that they were probably never getting out of their situation. But they tried not to lose hope. That was their story. That was it. That's all they knew, and they didn't know anything else. It's as far as they could see. But unbeknownst to them, there was another story that was taking place above. It was a story that they couldn't see, they couldn't hear anything, and if they wanted to try to prove that that story was taking place, they had no means or ability to prove it. But there was another story taking place, and it was moving forward and moving forward quickly. Engineers have been drilling around the clock. NASA even got involved. They asked for NASA's help because they said, if we find the miners, we're then going to have to, if we find them, then we're going to have to figure out a way how to get them out of there. So how are we going to keep them alive for potentially weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks on end? Families, they didn't want to leave the mine site. And so they stuck around and built this makeshift tent city. Maybe you know the story, maybe you've watched the movie, and it captured the world's attention. And so the world referred to that tent city that had been created as Camp Hope. But the 33 miners, they knew nothing of the story that was happening above. It was on that day 17 that one of the 8 boreholes actually punctured through the chamber where they were barely surviving. So how did they up above know that they had reached the miners? When they pulled back that particular drill bit, there was something taped to the end of it. It was a note, and here was that note. For those of you who know Spanish, you know what that says. For the rest of us, let me translate it for you. It says, all 33 of us are fine in the shelter. All 33 of us are fine in the shelter. 17 days, 33 men living inside a story that looked from where they were standing like it was already over. And the whole time there was a second story running above. It was a story that they couldn't see, that they didn't know about, until the moment that drill bit broke through into their story, and the upper story and the lower story came together. It would take another 69 days for them to get the last man out who rode up in the steel capsule that they had created, and that person finally saw sunlight. But that note, all 33 of us are fine in the shelter. That's a picture that I want you to hold on to today. As we think about these 33 miners who said, all of us are fine in this shelter. We're fine in the midst of what looked like tragedy. We're fine in the midst of a 700,000-ton weight being upon them. And that's a picture of something that every single one of us deals with. Every day, we are living our lives in our shelter, so to speak, our refuge. We see what's happening today, right now. That's what we see. We see the road in front of us, but we don't see what's around the corner. We don't know about the phone call that will come tomorrow. We don't know what door is going to open up tomorrow or the next day or the next week or the next month. We don't know what problem is going to show up no matter how hard we try to contingency plan today. We don't know what's coming. We don't know how something that happens today is going to be connected to something that's going to happen 10 years from now. We experience life one scene at a time. And one of the biggest mistakes that you and I can make is actually assuming that what it is that we do see is all that there is to see. We're getting ready to kick off the story, and I hope everybody's excited and ready and diving in. We're going to be in the Word together. And as we go through the story, there's two words that I want you to hold on to. The first word is the word upper. Everybody say upper. The second word is the word lower. Everybody say lower. What's the first word? What's the second word? Lower. One is the upper story, and one is the lower story. And you see this happening throughout the Scripture. The lower story is what you and I can see from where we're standing. It's our shelter, our refuge. The upper story is what God sees and what God is doing in the larger plan. We see what's happening in our story, but God sees how our story fits into His larger story. We experience one scene, one chapter at a time. God sees the whole story, the whole movie, so to speak. So what does that mean for you and I? Well, first of all, it means a couple things. But first of all, it means that you and I need to be very careful about conclusions that we draw about our life, about circumstances, about anything that's happening when we're in the middle of the story and we can't see the whole story. It also means that we'll probably wrestle with a question that a lot of us think about. It's a question that basically says, hey, if God can see what I can't see, if He sees this upper story and I only have my lower story, why doesn't He stop something before it gets to us? Right? Why doesn't God, if God knows and He sees the whole story and He knows about the diagnosis, why doesn't He step in and do something about it? If He sees the accident, if He sees the betrayal, if He sees the divorce or the job loss or the decision that your child is about to make, why doesn't He step in and do something about it? God, rescue us. God, save us. God, help us from my 700,000-ton weight rock that has come upon me. Well, the Bible doesn't give you and I one simple explanation for every one of our circumstances or situations, but it does show us this. And that's that what makes no sense to us in our lower story, it can actually look very different from the upper story perspective. And there's no book in the Bible that more completely shows and talks about what I'm talking about than the book of Job. Some of you know the story or part of the story. Job lived thousands of years ago, and the Bible describes him as a man who he genuinely loved God. He wasn't perfect, but he was a man who loved God and who was faithful. Cared about his family. He lived with integrity, and he had been blessed, and he was incredibly successful. Then, in a matter of just moments, everything collapsed in his life. Job's life completely fell apart. In a single day, Job lost all his wealth. He lost his livelihood also. In that same day, news came to him that no parent ever wants to receive, that all 10 of his children had been killed in a house when the house suddenly collapsed. The 700,000-ton weight actually killed his children. And before Job can even process what's going on, his health falls apart. Job chapter 2 tells us that he was covered in painful sores from head to toe. And it was so bad for him, he took pieces of pottery and he would be scraping all the sores on his body. Here's somebody who's been faithful to God. And from the story, the lower story, the one that Job knew, none of it made sense. It's brutal. And he must be thinking, God, what in the world are you doing to me? And the question that so many of us find ourselves asking, why? Why is this happening? Well, the book of Job does something very unusual. Before Job's life falls apart, the Bible actually pulls back, the camera, so to speak, and lets us see something that Job can't see. You and I get a glimpse into, we get to see the upper story. We get to see the upper story conversation that's taking place in the heavenly realm. And Satan, Lucifer, the devil, basically goes before God and says, hey, God, of course Job follows you. I mean, look at his life, right? Look what you've given him. You've blessed him in every way imaginable. But if you take all this blessing away from his life, he'll turn his back on you. He won't trust you. He's only trusting you because how much blessing you've given him. And so God allows Job to be tested. Unfortunately for Job, he doesn't get to read Job chapter 1 like you and I get to read. He doesn't know the upper story. He doesn't get to see what's happening there. Instead, he simply lives in the lower story disaster that is about to unfold in his life. And in the lower story, a messenger shows up and says, hey, all your livestock are gone and dead. All your possessions are gone. And another person comes and says, hey, all your kids just died. And as that happens, his body just develops all these sores and boils. And it's awful, and he's infected and inflicted all over his body. And in the midst of all of that, he has no idea about the conversation that God has with the evil one in Job chapter 1. Now, I don't know about you, but I would love to have Job chapter 1 that I could read for my life. Anybody here, wouldn't you like that? Wouldn't you love to know that, hey, in the midst of your 700,000-ton weight, whatever that looks like in your life right now, wouldn't you love to know that, oh, okay, here's what's going on. Oh, okay, this is why this is happening. Oh, this is why God is allowing this. Oh, okay, now that I understand all that, then I'll go ahead and trust you, God. Okay, I get it now. Job never gets that note. And most of the time, neither do you and I. As I look at my own life, I realize that, man, I am so much better at trusting God after I know exactly what he's doing. I'm so much better at trusting God after I know exactly how it's going to work out. Wait. That's not actually trust, is it? That's not faith. All you and I get is exactly what's happening in front of us. And so we have to decide. We don't get the upper story. So we have to decide, are we going to trust the God who sees what we cannot see? Am I going to trust the God who is in charge of the upper story in the midst of my lower story? Job doesn't get an explanation. He doesn't get Job chapter 1 for what's happening in his life. So everybody around him, they just start inventing answers to why this is happening in his life. Job's wife looks at the lower story that he's experiencing and going through and that she's going through. And she says, it says in Job chapter 2, verse 9, his wife asks, Job, why do you still trust God? Why don't you curse him and die? Now, Heather and I have been married for 34 years. And as a perfect husband who has never had to try her patience, I have beyond tested Heather's patience. And we have had challenges. We have had some pretty big difficulties, hard challenges. But as far as I know, we have never reached curse God and die status in our relationship. And hopefully you haven't either. Job's wife, she sees all these tragedies and she thinks, oh, I know what it all means. And that includes deciding that God can no longer be trusted. Job's friends come along and they say, well, that's not it, but we have an explanation. Let us explain to you. We have different conclusions. Eliphaz says to Job in Job chapter 4, verse 7, he says, Job, stop and think. Do the innocent die? When have the upright been destroyed? In other words, Job, this has got to be your fault. You might have done something to deserve what's happened to you. Bildad, his friend, takes it even further. Job has just buried all 10 of his children. And he says in chapter 8, verse 4, your children must have sinned against you. So their punishment was well deserved. Can you imagine that? You ever give that advice to somebody? And then Zophar, another friend, comes along in Job chapter 11, verse 6 and says, God is doubtless punishing you far less than you even deserve. In other words, hey, Job, it could be worse. You have any friends who passed away and you look at the family members and say, hey, it could be worse. You're not doing that. That's about the worst advice you could ever give to someone. Some friends, they see Job's suffering and they assume they know. They assume they know why God allowed it. They assume they understand what's going on, and yet they're completely wrong. They can see the lower story, but they have no idea what's happening in the upper story. And we still do the same things today. Something painful might happen in our life, and we start writing God's part of the story how we think it should go. We start writing God's upper story for him. Oh, well, I'm going through this, so clearly God is punishing me. And some people, depending on your religious background, that's kind of a big thing. Some of you might draw the conclusions, hey, God just must not care about me. Some of you feel like you've been faithful to God, like Job. And maybe your conclusions are, well, God clearly forgot me. We might even come up with like a so-called positive explanation. Well, you know, God closed this door because he has something better for me next week. I've spent a lot of time praying with a lot of people in this church, and I'd have a lot less to pray about if that was true. Because the better didn't show up the next week, or the next week, or the next week, or the next week. But Job, he doesn't step into any of that lane. He doesn't listen to his wife and curse God and walk away from God and then just say, I'll just rather die. He refuses to turn his back on God. He'll ask God hard questions and he'll get angry and he'll suffer and he'll grieve. He's also not going to be some guy who gives this fake smile on his face, act like everything's okay, and then give the usual cliche, hey, everything happens for a reason. No. Through it all, what does Job do? He keeps leaning into God instead of walking away from God. And in Job chapter 2, he even says, hey, should we accept only good things from the hand of God and never anything bad? Man, talk about an amazing upper story perspective. Job doesn't understand. He doesn't know the upper story. He doesn't see it. But Scripture tells us that in Job chapter 2, verse 10, in all this, Job did not sin in what he said. Job just decides, hey, I don't understand it. I don't get it. It's awful, but it doesn't mean I'm walking away from God. It doesn't mean that I'm walking away from God when I don't know or understand the answer. Eventually, God will end up speaking to Job if you know the story. And that's where it gets even more interesting. And God doesn't show up and say, hey, Job, let me give you Job chapter 1. Hey, Job, let me give you the upper story that you didn't know about. Let me tell you all about it. No. That's not what God does. Instead, God shows up in Job chapter 38 and moving forward. And God actually kind of goes into Job, lays into Job a little bit. So Job, all right, here's what we're going to do. I know you've been going through all this stuff. I want to ask you some hard questions. Questions, by the way, that Job's not going to have any answers to. He's not going to understand. He's not going to comprehend. So he starts asking Job about creation, about the stars, about the sea, the weather, animals. He asks him all these questions. And what comes out of that is Job realizes something. He realizes that he's not getting all the answers, but he can trust the one who has the answers in the middle of what he's going through in his lower story. Job didn't get an explanation, but he got a far grander understanding of the God that he was choosing to follow. Because God was essentially saying something to Job. Job, I know your pain is real, but your perspective is limited. That's why God raised all these questions. Job, I know it's real for you, but there's things that you don't understand that are beyond your comprehension. That's where some of you are living today. You have a 700,000 ton weight, and it's real. And God looks at you and says, your pain is real. And I know it, but you just don't see the whole picture. And you don't understand all that there is. And so, as Job decides he's not going to get all the answers, but he's going to trust God, that's why I'm hoping you will hold to and cling to something this entire time through the story, and for maybe, hopefully, the rest of your life. And that is simply this. Don't judge the story. Don't draw conclusions about the story while you're in the middle of the story. Because there's so much that you don't see or don't know. But isn't that what we tend to do, right? We look at our marriage in the middle of our story, in the middle of the chapter of our story, we say, well, my marriage, it's headed for doom, and it'll never recover. My kids are never coming back. You look at what you're going through with somebody and go, I will never get past this hurt. I'll never get this job. I will never have an opportunity to get this home. God is not doing anything to help me out. What is all that? When we go there, it's us making final judgments, drawing conclusion, while the story is still being written. Think about some of the stories in the Bible. Joseph gets betrayed by his family, left for dead, sold into slavery, put in prison. You stop right there, you're like, that lower story looks terrible. But God is still working, and there's more to the story, and you turn the page and you realize there was something going on, and eventually God uses Joseph to save millions of people. You could go on and on with those type of stories in the scriptures, with David and Goliath, the Israelites trying to cross the Red Sea, Esther, if you know that story. All these stories that at one point, at one chapter, you look at it and go, it looks awful, but there's a whole story, there's an upper story that you don't see at that point. That doesn't mean, by the way, that every hard situation in those stories gets a great and nice and neat ending. But it does mean that you and I should be very, very, very careful about judging the story while they're in the middle of the story, because we don't know what's coming next. What we can know is what the Apostle Paul said. And the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 8, verse 28 said this. He said, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Now, as you look at that verse, I want you to notice what Paul doesn't say. He doesn't say everything's good. He doesn't say cancer's good. He doesn't say, hey, betrayal in your life, that's a great thing. He doesn't say the abuse you've suffered, that's, celebrate that. No. That's not what Paul is saying. He's saying that God can work, that God can work in the midst of that tragedy, and somehow he can bring good out of it in your life. The next verse tells us what some of that good is, which is this. You might go through something, have a 700,000 ton weight in your life in tragedy, but God will use that. And one of the ways he uses it is to conform you to the image of his Son. It's one piece of the good that can come out of tragedy in our life. God is shaping you and I to become more like his Son. So the promise from God isn't that every chapter will feel good or end up perfect. The promise is that God can still work in a chapter that you would never have chosen. And whatever that chapter is, God can use it to shape you to become more like Jesus. We see a chapter, but God sees how it all fits into the bigger story. Now, I know most of us have an idea of what our lives should look like, and then we just kind of ask God to come along and help us get there, right? Like if you get to write your own lower story, what's that going to look like? Is your life going to suck? No. Are you going to be extremely unsuccessful? No. Are you going to be sick? No. Right? What are you going to do? If you're going to write your story, I'm going to have this, I'm going to have this, I'm going to live here, I'm going to make this salary. In fact, I forget the salary thing. I'm just going to have so much money that God gives me that I don't even have to work. Right? We're going to write this story. And so that's kind of what we do. And then we say, God, here's the story. Can you bless it? That's not how it works. That's a lower story misunderstanding because God's doing something. Jesus taught us a different way to think about it. And in Matthew chapter 10, he said, hey, when you talk to God, when you pray, here's how you want to approach God. You want to say, hey, God, may your kingdom come soon. May your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's an upper story prayer. In other words, you're not looking for God to squeeze your plans into his story that you've already written. Instead, you want your lower story aligned with his upper story. So my question is, are you actually trying to follow God's story? Or are you asking God to bless your story that you've created? What are you doing? What are you choosing? Isaiah chapter 55 says this. God tells us, my thoughts are nothing like your thoughts, and my ways are far beyond anything you could even imagine. That was kind of the conversation God was having with Job. Verse 9, for just as the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher, or one translation says, my ways are superior than your ways, and my thoughts are higher or superior than your thoughts. What does that mean? It means that there's going to be moments that God's way doesn't make sense from where we're standing. And we might ask God why. There's nothing wrong with asking why. But asking why isn't the most important question. The most important question that you and I can ask is, God, what does faithfulness look like in my life right now? What does faithfulness look in my life right now? What does that look like for you? What does that look like in the chapter you're going through right now? What does that look like in the midst of your 700,000 ton weight that is in your life? What does faithfulness look like right now? You don't have to understand the chapter that you're in. It doesn't make sense, but you can choose to trust the author who is writing the story. And so, as we begin, as we dive into the story, as we read the scriptures together, as you read those throughout the week, I hope a couple questions come to mind. You read the story and you're asking, hey, what's the lower story going on in this particular story I'm reading, this particular Bible character? And what is the upper story that's taking place? And you and I, because we're reading scriptures, we get to see both sometimes. Sometimes we don't. That's why we ask the question. Here's the lower story. What is God doing with the upper story? And here's my hope. My hope is that somewhere along the way, this upper story, lower story thinking, that is so infused into your life that you begin to think this way. That you begin to, as you're going through your chapter of life, when you're going through whatever it is, you're thinking upper story, lower story. I'm living in my lower story. There's an upper story here. I don't fully understand it. I don't fully grasp it, but I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to take the next faithful step. That's what I know. Because I recognize I'm likely not getting Job chapter 1 explanations. So whatever chapter you are in your life, whatever that looks like for you, what step of trust do you need to take in the midst of your story, in the midst of the chapter you're in? What is God leading you to? What is God calling you to? Trust God and don't assume that all that you are involved in and see is all there is to the story. So don't judge the story in the middle of the story that you're in. Let's pray.